All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. As many of y'all know, this webinar is part of a series called Unpacking Coaching and presented by the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. I'm Mary Louise Hemmeter, and I'm mostly going to be your host today. We're going to be talking today, or the title for today's webinar is Coaching Conversations, Motivational Interviewing as a Strategy to Prompt Reflection and Practice Change. And I'm very excited about this webinar. I'm really excited today to have Amy Hunter and Julia Sales here, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you, and then we'll get started. So Julia, you want to start?
Thanks, ML. Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Sales. I am a licensed mental health clinician by training and also have worked as a pyramid model coach. And I currently am out of Georgetown University and support the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations as well. And I'll pass it over to Amy.
Thanks so much, Julia, and thanks, ML, for getting us started. It's so nice to be here with all of you. I am Amy Hunter. I'm also at Georgetown University, and I'm part of the leadership team on the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. I am a social work by training, so you will probably hear that lens coming through if there's any other social workers out there in our audience. And I'm really excited to be with you. All right, so let's jump right in. These are our learning objectives. I'm not going to read them to you. I'm going to try to avoid reading slides today. But I do want to tell you that we're here for about an hour. And so we are just going to scratch the surface of motivational interviewing. This is not full-scale training on motivational interviewing, which would take probably a couple of days, but really thinking about some highlights, we tend to say sometimes borrowing from motivational interviewing, and then applying it to coaching. And so we'll talk about some maybe common challenges in coaching and really think about how we can use some of those motivational interviewing strategies and really conversational skills in our coaching. And then we want to leave you with some reflective questions. Reflection is a big, and self-awareness and reflection is a big part of engaging in motivational interviewing practices successfully. And so we want to leave you with some thoughts to prompt your thinking about how you're doing this already, perhaps, or how you can enhance your practice using some of these strategies. So we can go to the next slide. And so those of you on this webinar should be very familiar with this graphic, the pyramid model. And what I want to say here is that, of course, the pyramid model is an evidence-based framework, as is motivational interviewing. So there have probably been over 1,000 different peer-reviewed studies or articles about motivational interviewing, and it maps on really well to your coaching at every level of the pyramid. So whether you're coaching on effective workforce or really thinking about what are those policies, practices, systems, you might be meeting with a director of a program, you can use these strategies there. You can use these strategies at the universal level. So thinking about building responsive and nurturing relationships, or what environments look like. You can use these strategies at the targeted level, thinking about how are we building targeted social emotional supports. And you can think about using these strategies at the intensive intervention level as well. So thinking about a particular plan for a child or work with a particular family. And you might hear me talk about teaching. You might hear me talk about early interventionists. I'm going to try to maybe use the term providers to work across, but we really think these conversational skills can be used in your coaching, whether you're coaching at a early care and education site or whether you're coaching in a early intervention program. So we can go to the next slide. Great, thank you. So let's talk a little bit before we dive into the motivational interviewing aspect about what some might be common challenges you find in your coaching. And you may resonate with some that we've put on this slide and the next slide. you may have some others. And so we encourage you to put some of those challenges in the chat. I'd love to hear if you resonate with ones we are going to describe, or whether you have some others. But one of the challenges we wanted to put up there out front is, as a coach, you may be seen as an evaluator, whether you are an evaluator or not in your role. You may also be seen in the context of a power dynamic, right? And no matter how hard or what steps you take to sort of even that playing field, and we think the motivational interviewing strategies can help, but we just want to encourage you to be cognizant or be aware that you may very much, even if your role is not a formal role that has power over somebody else, or that is in an evaluative role, you might be seen that way, or you might be perceived in that way. So that can kind of hinder your coaching at times. Some other common challenges from the provider side is that providers may fear what they don't know about coaching. So if they haven't had a coaching experience before, they may be unsure of what all is entailed in the coaching. They may be, sort of reluctant or skeptical to engage in something that they haven't had much experience or practice. And many teachers and many early interventionists haven't had coaching as part of their training or their background, so it might be new to them. They might be concerned about how much time coaching takes. We all know that in this particular point in time, we are facing significant staff shortages, and so time is at a premium. And so, coachees, whether they're early interventionists or teachers, may be worried about, how much time is this going to take? How much is this going to take me away from my other tasks? They may be worried about change, right? And we often in the motivational interviewing realm talk about stages of change. And so folks, change might not be even on their radar, right? They might not even be thinking about enhancing their practice or what goals they might have. And so the whole concept of being ready to adopt new practices or make some practice change might be new. Coachees might also be worried about, does coaching mean that I'm performing badly? Am I getting coaching because you think I need coaching, right? Or that, you've identified something about my practice that really is concerning. And this relates to that second bullet, is what if someone has some significant self-doubts to begin with? And, do they then worry that being observed or being coached might expose them, right? Expose their own worries about their practice, or feeling more vulnerable. Or perhaps some of our coachees have had poor experiences in the past with other types of, whether it's coaching, whether it's a supervisor, or just not having had a good experience of others who have tried to be in that professional development role. And we think that motivational interviewing can really address some of these common concerns. So what is motivational interviewing? We talked about some of the challenges that might be inherent in a coaching relationship. And let's talk now about what motivational interviewing is. And before I talk about what it is, let's talk about what it isn't, because so many times I think there's a misperception about what it is. And people think maybe that it is a strategy, or it is an intervention to get people to do something, right? To make people change behavior, or to motivate people, or to give direction, or to give advice. And it is absolutely not any of those things. Really what it is a set of conversational skills to enhance a relationship. And in this case, we're talking about a coachee relationship, but to help those that we're coaching or that we're working with to feel more confident and to clarify their own interests, their own values, their own motivation for making changes in their practice. And we can go to the next slide. But what is at the heart of motivational interviewing, and this is where it blends so beautifully with pyramid, is a trusting relationship. So really the biggest factor in using motivational interviewing is really building that trusting, authentic relationship with people that we're coaching. And we can go to the next slide. And so how does motivational help in our coaching? How does it help some of those challenges that we laid out? Well, as we just said, it supports relationship building and really thinking about how we build a really trusting, honest, authentic relationship. Motivational interviewing also helps clarify, excuse me, what the person that we're working with, what their interests are, what their values. It explores uncertainty and actually works through resistance. So motivational interviewing came about in the 80s, so it's been around quite a while. And it originally was developed out of the substance use field and out of particularly working with people who didn't necessarily want to change, right? So who were really quote unquote resistant to change, but were actually mandated to treatment. And so now, of course, motivational interviewing has been applied to all kinds of different fields, including the education field and including supporting teachers to implement positive practices and practices that support behaviors and social emotional development. But it really has some excellent techniques to work through that quote unquote resistance that maybe some of you have had experience with. And we're going to talk more about that as we go. The other thing I want to just mention on this one slide, oh, thank you so much. And we'll pick up this theme a couple of times, but is motivational interviewing also emphasizes the person who we're coaching, the coachee's sense of autonomy. So this is really about them making decisions about their practice. And I think sometimes, as I know I've had the experience as a coach or as a helper, that I've worried that if they don't pick up the practices, or if they don't make progress, or if they aren't moving forward on their goal, then it speaks to my abilities as a coach, versus really thinking it's up to them, right? This is their practice, and I'm here to support and facilitate their decision-making around their own practice. And so we can go to the next slide. So what is the process? We talked about what it is. We talked a little bit about how it can help some of our coaching challenges. The process of engaging, using these motivational interviewing strategies starts with engaging, right? You're going to hear, I've already talked about it probably 3 or 4 times, right? The relationship building piece, but really beginning with that empathetic response, that question of how can I help, right? How can we work together? Really contracting, setting the stage, and whether you're getting to know the person that you're coaching or whether it's an ongoing relationship, you might be contracting each time you meet with them to say, what do we want to talk about today? What do you want to put on the agenda? How have you been since we've last met? So really those basic relationship skills. And then moving into focusing. So what should we focus on today? Right? You've laid out a lot of things that you want to think about or that you want to talk about. What's the one that's most important to you today? And so really trying to hone in and focus. And then we have a series of evoking. This is where we're really thinking about that part of the person that does want to change their practice a little bit, even if they really don't want to change, or even if they're really not sure about engaging in coaching. I bet there's a part of them that wants to change something that they're doing. And so you might want to say, why would you want to make this change instead of a different change? Or how would you go about making that change? Why is it important to you to make this change? What if you didn't make any changes? What if you just did exactly the same practices that you've been doing? What would happen then? So really evoking a conversation about what would happen if we make some changes, what would happen if we didn't. And then the last, yes.
Amy, can I ask you a quick question? Yeah. So what about if we're having a hard time helping them understand what they might gain from changing, would you ever consider talking to them about how it might help children, like to take a little bit of the pressure off it being about them? Would you do that? Or how would you do that, maybe, is the question.
I think that's a great question. And I might try to ask some, and we'll talk more about these types of questions in a minute, but ask some questions about maybe, or I guess this is what comes to mind when you ask that question to me, is what would be the impact if we don't make any changes on the children in your care? Or if you made this little tweak, or if you changed your schedule, or you changed up the room arrangement, or you worked with this family in this different way, what do you think would be the impact on the children or on the child in the home? So I guess that's where I might go with that.
Okay.
Julia, she's going to talk in a minute here, but do you have any thoughts on that as well?
I think that's a great question. And I think similarly, thinking too about how might it feel, right? How might it feel for you? How might it feel for the kids? And just again, like you said, Amy, being able to have a piece of that reflection in there so that it's really the coachee or the provider who is driving that, right? And we're not sort of putting, I think it would feel really great if and I think sometimes that can be our tendency as a coach when we see something, but really being able to step back and hold off a little bit to leave that space for the provider to come up with their own thoughts around it, their own responses.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I love the question. And it actually feeds right into the next slide beautifully. If we want to go to the next slide. Yeah. So what you were talking about, Julia, is really engaging the coachee or the person in front of us as the expert in their own situation, right? They know their children best. They know their families best. They are truly the expert in their particular situation. Now, as a coach or as someone who's been in this field for a long time, I also have a lot of expertise, but I'm not expert at their particular situation. And so the more I can get them to see themselves or to talk about themselves related to their situation and honor how much they know about their particulars, right? I think that can be really helpful. And again, you see the same theme bubbling up around, ultimately it's their choice, right? Ultimately, we can't, as much as we have ideas or we have thoughts about ways in which we think maybe if they did these things, things would go better. It's really their choice, right? And it's really got to be coming from them in terms of what decisions feel right for them. What are they able to do in terms of changes? What are they willing to do? What are they ready to do? All of those kinds of pieces. And so, here we're really thinking about, how do we collaborate? How are we partners in this? How do we honor the experience that we both bring to the situation? And so we can go to the next slide. So we talked about what it is. We talked about the process, sort of where do we go in MI, or like the way we set it up. We talked about the principles of partnering, or how we are in relationship with the coachee. And here are some of the skills. So here's some of like the nuts and the bolts of the actual conversations. And so I encourage you, as you're thinking about it, to think about your own practice as a coach and think, how often am I using these skills? And I bet you're using these skills quite often. So open-ended questions, right? Standard conversational practice. Those are questions that can't be answered with a yes or no, right? And you have some examples here of those question starters, right? Tell me more about that. Can you say more about that? Or Julia encouraged us to think about the person's own reflective piece, right? What is that experience like for you? How are you doing when that happens, right? Those are all really great examples of open-ended questions. And then affirmations, right? So acknowledging the coachee's experience, right? And this is really genuine. That happens to me often. I'm often incredibly impressed or incredibly kind of in awe of people's ability to persist, given how difficult it sounds like it is for them, right? How do you get up every day and go in when what you're describing to me sounds so difficult, right? And so really affirming what they've been able to do so far. And affirming that they're even engaging with you in the conversation. Thanks so much for trusting me and sharing with me the information, or being vulnerable to talk about the kinds of things that you may be struggling with. And then reflective or active listening, right? So using those sentence starters like, it sounds like you're saying, or it seems like you're feeling X, or sounds like maybe you're a little unsure about this process, or a little unsure if these ideas that you've talked about or that we've talked about together might work. Okay? And then also, this is where your nonverbal active listening comes in, nodding your head, leaning in, really letting someone know that, no, I'm not looking at my phone, I'm not texting, I'm actually, as much as possible, 100% listening and present and wanting to understand where you are, what's happening for you, what you're saying to me, either in your words, in your body language, like I'm all in, right? And then last, the summary, putting it all together. So you've been talking to someone for, 5-10 minutes, and you want to check in. Let me see, do I have this right? I don't know. I want to check. Please correct me if I don't have this right. Am I understanding what you're saying? Do I have it? Did I miss something? Really checking in to make sure that you got their kind of gist of what they have to say, or their cohesive story. Then we can go to the next slide. And so I wish I would have put one more picture on here, and that would be a picture of two people walking together on a journey together. And that as the coach, you might be standing alongside someone, taking that journey towards improved process together. But instead, sometimes what happens is we feel like we're in a wrestling match, right? That, and if we are live, if we were in person, I would ask you to raise your hand if you'd ever experienced resistance, but maybe I'll have you put it in the chat. Just put a yes if you've ever experienced quote unquote resistance. Yes. No, thank you. Thank you. You're out there. Yes, I think as a coach, everyone has experienced that at some point in time. And it might be helpful for you to think about these visuals, because in order to have resistance, you need something to resist against, right? Something has to be there for you to push up against, or for you to, in this case with the wrestling, grapple with, right? But what if instead of wrestling with the person that you're coaching and trying to, push back or convince them or argue or become defensive or all of those things that we naturally do, you considered it either as a walk, as I mentioned earlier, or a dancing partner. So when they pull back, right, and they're like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to do this coaching thing, or I don't know about the goals that we set out, or I'm just not even really going to talk to you about that. What if instead of, pushing them into a corner or backing out yourself or getting in a defensive posture, you leaned in and said, tell me more about that. Or I noticed maybe this isn't a good time to reflect on the goal that we set last time. Can you tell me more about that? Maybe something else is on your mind, right? And really asking more questions about what you might be reading, really being more interested, really being willing to set aside the goal for that particular moment, knowing that in the long run, you'll get there faster if you sort of pause and lean in and dance or walk with the coachee versus trying to wrestle with it. And we can go to the next slide. And this is another technique that I think can be really useful when thinking about that, quote unquote resistance that we all face at times. I have found this to be really useful. So if someone has identified a goal, or if you are identifying a goal with, collaboratively with a coachee that you're working with, you might ask them how strongly they feel about that goal. So let's just say, for example, The goal might be helping children to offer more choices, for children, to have more opportunities for children to make choice. And so you would say, how strongly do you feel about that? Maybe the person says, 4, right? I don't feel super strongly about it. I may or may not, increase my opportunities to provide children choice. I maybe around 4. Well, my natural inclination, and maybe your natural inclination, might be to say, well, how come you don't say 10? It's a really important practice, right? But instead, a great way to go about this is to say, okay, so you're at a 4. It's not unimportant to you, but it's not your most important thing. How come you're not at a 1? How come you didn't say it wasn't important at all? And now they're going to start telling you why they think it is important. And so, this is not a trick to get them to, change their behavior, but a part of them does feel like that's important. And saying it out loud is much better than them talking about why they don't think it's important, right? And so I have found this technique to be really useful when you're stuck, when you're in a situation where you feel like we're wrestling, we're in that resistant phase. And then I'm going to turn it over to Julia, who has some good examples. And then I'm going to look at the chat because it's been hard for me to look at the chat while I'm talking. But Julia, I know you as a coach have had some examples that you can share with us and some experiences to help this come alive a little bit more.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amy. I feel so seen when everyone put the yes in there about the resistance, because I just wanted to elevate back, right? I think that's a natural piece, and it's really important when we sort of are noticing, whoa, I'm not so excited to go into this coaching session, or, oh, this is like a deep breath one. Here we go. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to get. How do we reflect on and start with, how are we feeling as the coach? What am I noticing, right? What's my body state? Am I sweating a whole lot? Am I sitting there, tripping over my words because I'm kind of anxious or nervous as I'm going in? Am I coming in and I'm falling back on patterns that have worked for me in the past? Like, I'm going to be the expert. I'm going to be the teller. I'm just going to push this resource across and say, here, let's look at this, because it's something really concrete and we can just go bullet point by bullet point, right? So we can notice in ourselves as the coach some of those patterns that might be coming up for ourselves and how we're feeling and what is our sort of regulatory state at. And that can also be really important as we're thinking about walking alongside, right? This isn't about us being a good coach or a bad coach, or, oh, we didn't make the progress we wanted to see. And sometimes it can be really easy to fall back into that thought pattern. And so I would just encourage too, as we're thinking about rolling with resistance and some of these examples, and you all may have examples coming to mind right now, like, oh, I can picture this person, or I can picture that practitioner or this situation, just to start with checking in with ourselves and thinking about, how are we feeling about this? What is our body telling us? What are our thoughts telling us? And then what are some techniques we're going to use to really be in the space, to be curious, to be open, and to be walking alongside? So we have a couple of scenarios here just to sort of highlight what it could look like. And I noticed in the chat there was lots of this idea of like being voluntold, like you maybe didn't choose the coaching relationship, you are walking in and the practitioner is being told they need to be part of this. I think we can see where resistance pops up in some of these places. In this particular example, we have a coach who has a standing relationship with a teacher, and this teacher has already stated, transitions are hard for me. They're really tricky. They feel chaotic, and I'm most likely to see challenging behaviors during transitions. So this coach maybe is like, great, here we go. I'm going to do the teapot. We're getting ready for feedback. Whoop, whoop. This is going to be an easy one. I know my goal. Like, here, yes. So we go to do this teapot feedback. We've already talked to the teacher. They've already identified transitions. We look at the teapot. We're getting ready to do feedback. Our scale has also told us, yep, transitions are a place we might want to focus on. And so we give the feedback, and our teacher is saying, actually, I'm feeling really good about transitions. It's not a place I want to work on. It's not a goal I want to have. And so then what do we do, right? This might be a place where we are feeling some resistance within that coaching relationship. So we can go to the next slide. So some of the motivational interviewing techniques or strategies we might use in an instance like this are, how do we start by just reflecting on that resistance? And it's really easy, right? These are things we do, but a content statement like, hey, transitions aren't feeling like an area that you want to focus on right now during our coaching time, right? And then the second piece of this is for us to be thinking about as the coach, what is the part that we disagree with the most? I, as the coach of this teacher, might have been like, yes, do the transitions. The transitions are going to help. They're going to help you. They're going to help the kids. Everyone's going to feel better if we do the transitions. But I need to say that's the part where I, as a coach, am feeling like a place that I really want to push. And so how do we emphasize the place that we as coaches disagree with the most? And what that might sound like is something along the lines of, you don't want to set a specific goal on transitions right now, right? So we're going to emphasize that piece. We can go to the next slide. From there, I think this one is really a really helpful content statement. We're going to think about the inconsistency, because remember, this is a teacher we've had a relationship with for a while. We may have done some observations. We've had some coaching sessions where they've identified transitions can be really hard and they can feel really chaotic, right? And so we want to hold that idea of, okay, they've said and identified transitions are hard, and they don't want to work on the transitions right now. They don't want a goal around transitions. So as we think about that, we might have a content statement that says something along the lines of, on one hand, transitions can feel chaotic. And there are times when challenging behaviors might occur in your room or are most likely to occur in your classroom. On the other hand, you don't really feel ready to focus on transitions right now during our coaching time together. So again, we're leaning into some of those motivational strategies around reflection and being able to reflect back the situation that we're seeing, that inconsistency. We can go to the next slide.
Julia, I just have to say that's one of my favorite strategies.
So too.
I really love holding both sides. And so often someone doesn't speak to the part of the situation or the part that doesn't want to change or that is worried about change or that's reluctant to change. And I think the more we're able to sort of hold or name, yeah, you can want both of these things at the same time. You can want to make this change, but you also can be sort of reluctant and concerned and to have all of those challenges, that we named earlier. And so I love the strategy of being able to hold both and name both.
I love a good and, Amy, right? It doesn't have to be a but, right? I think sometimes we fall into that place of, but you said you wanted to work on transitions, right? And so when we shift it to the and, transitions feel really hard and you're not ready to work on them right now, or that's not a place you want to focus our time together. It does open up a different space. And I think to me, it also leaves room to loop back, right? It feels more open than now I'm pushing sort of my coaching agenda, and that might not feel good. We know that that might shut people down. It might just not be a place where we're getting that, again, that idea of mutuality, of we're walking alongside one another. And so it can be a great place to think about that power differential that many people may experience, and how are we really saying this is about a mutual respect and a mutual relationship versus me coming in and telling you what to do. And I think that gets at some of these strategies as well. So we can emphasize that this really is the provider's choice, right? So you get to decide what would be most helpful for you. And so there may be another piece of the puzzle that we're not aware of. Things may have changed since we had that coaching conversation. This person might say, you know what, that was really important. It is still really important to me. And I don't have the energy to do that right now. I'm feeling really stressed out. It feels really big, right? So we can think about how being able to say you get to choose might open up some more conversation on understanding where the motivational level is and why it might be that way. And then we shift our focus, right? So we're not going to say, well, okay, then we just won't set a goal ever. We're not going to say that, right? We're going to say, then what area would you want to focus on? What area or what right now would make your day feel less chaotic, or what would feel most helpful? And so start to think about how we have that conversation, how we make that shift, and set up some of our action planning from there. We can go to our next slide. So,
hey, Julia, can I ask you a question? I hope this isn't too much off track, but we've got a couple of questions. So one is, will you go back, Ashley, to the previous slide? So there were some questions about the ruler thing that Amy asked, and what if you ask them and they say a 0 or a 1, right? So not at all interested in working on that. How would you respond? So that's kind of the first question, and I wondered if it kind of fit here.
I can jump in, or Julia, do you want to take it first?
sure, you can go for it, Amy. That would be great.
Well, I think I would, as we were talking before about sort of leaning in, it's really, and talking about personal choice, right? And, the autonomy that someone has to feel that way, even if you've maybe had the same goal, and it's, you as the coach may think, gosh, we've been talking about the same goal for 3 weeks, and now you're telling me you're at a 0, right? Or a 1. Is to really lean into that and say, tell me more about that. Tell me more about, this isn't important to you at all right now. It couldn't be less important if they're at a 0, right? Tell me about that, or tell me what's happening now that might be different than when you decided, this was something that was important, if that was the case. Or if it's a new goal or a new relationship, to say, okay, this one is at a 0. Is there something else that might be more important to you on a scale? That might be a 3 or 4 or 5. What would be a 10? Like, this is a 0. This isn't on your radar. This is not it. You can expand or explore that a little bit more, and then maybe see if there's something else or something has changed. Do you have additional thoughts, Julia?
I would just say I could envision, maybe there's some people out there who are like, but what if they say everything's a 0? Or what if they say everything's a 1, right? Sometimes I think when we're in that voluntold space of we're working with someone who maybe hasn't had coaching before, hasn't had a good experience with coaching before, isn't quite sure why they're there. To me, if we're stuck in that 0 to 1, it also means let's back up a little. Like, let's really look and examine our relationship and think about how we look and see if it is a mutual relationship, or how we work towards that before continuing to push some of the goal setting, which can be tricky, right? But sometimes I think we need to slow down a little, or we do some of that contracting up front, but we might need to go back there, right? Whether it's a new relationship, or if it's a long-standing relationship and all of a sudden we're starting to see a whole bunch of resistance, how are we pushing ourselves kind of back down that pyramid to that relational place and looking at our collaborative relationship as it relates to coaching? And I think these strategies can be really helpful for that too.
I love that, Julia. I just keep visioning, like, in that situation that maybe we've gotten really far, or maybe the situation presents itself that we're pretty far out in front of where someone is, and so bringing like that visually, that back alongside them and say, let me stand next to you where you are, and let's talk about where you are, versus let me be in the opposite corner and try to come on.
And y'all, while you all are having this conversation, I'm like, I wish we had 2 hours for this call, because the comments people are making while y'all are talking are so interesting. And I think there's a whole bunch of comments that we're not going to get to today, but that are about what do we have to do to create a culture where coaching is seen as something that people want to get, right? And I think some of these questions about being told to, participate in coaching, that there's some things we can do in those situations, but we also have to be thinking about how do we create a culture and programs where people think coaching is a good thing, right? Rather than, I think some people see it as a punitive, can when they're told to do it, can view it more punitively. Yeah.
It reminds me, and it's so great that we're having this conversation about motivational interviewing, because it does remind me of why it was created, back in the 80s. It was developed out of people using substances and being mandated to treatment. They did not want to be there, right? Like that was not on their radar, not necessarily wanting to change their relationship to substances, but were mandated to treatment. And so these strategies, conversational strategies, pieces of conversation, ways to ask questions, ways to be in relationship with somebody, are really geared toward that kind of situation, where someone is in a situation that they didn't necessarily ask to be in, or they aren't necessarily fully on board with. And so I think, just kind of going back to what may feel like really basic strategies, or what may feel like, in a sense, like going backward to get forward later on, right? Julia, you said something about, slowing down a little bit. And so I often think of the phrase slowing down to speed up later, right? That you may be really worried about getting somewhere, but if you keep pushing to get there versus like taking a couple steps back, you probably are going to be more successful taking those couple steps back, or, slowing down a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, we want coaching to feel like a good, positive experience. Like my goal as a coach is to say, whether we met every goal we set or not, I want you to say, that was great. I want this in the future. Right. And so if we go from a place of saying, I was told I had to do this, I've had I've had teachers be like, I didn't want to sit with you, Julia. And I'm like, I know, I could feel it. Like, I do know that. I could tell, after we've established our relationship. But even if they're just on board for the buy-in of that, then to me, I've done my job, right? That means you're ready for the next person or the next experience that comes down the line. And I think it's similar to what we see sometimes with kids who have behaviors that challenge us. Sometimes we don't always get where we want to go, but we've done a really important piece of the work, and laying that relational foundation, or making it that positive experience where it really feels like we are in this together and it's an authentic experience, to me is a really big piece of that work. So this is another little scenario, right? And so in this scenario, we have Janelle, who is a super seasoned coach, and she is meeting with Sydney, who's a new provider and has never received coaching before and isn't quite sure what to expect. And Sydney isn't so familiar with the pyramid model, but she does have a lot of really great experience leading play groups for families and their children. And so this is thinking about how are we establishing that relationship on the front end. But I would be curious for you all to be thinking too, about, as we're thinking about strengthening relationships, are there longstanding coaching relationships you have where this could be a good place to refresh as we think about some of these strategies? So we can go to the next slide. So again, as we're thinking about this, we're really starting with that engagement strategy, right? How are we making sure we have and are laying the foundation for a collaborative and respectful and trusting coaching relationship? And so as we think about Sydney, this brand new teacher who doesn't have a whole lot of pyramid model knowledge, but has important experience to share, some of the questions we might ask are things like, what would be helpful for you to know about as we work together, right? What do you want to know about as we work? What do you want me to know about you as we work together, right? And that might be, I don't want to be here. For some of our teachers who have a lot of resistance, that's okay. If we can say, I can tolerate that, I can sit with that, then we are in a place where we can start to make movement, or we can start to explore that a little and make progress. We might also think about questions like, what questions do you have for me? What do you want to know about me? What are some of the things you might be interested in, right? What are your previous experiences, or what are some of your thoughts around coaching? What comes to mind for you as you hear coaching? And so that way we can sort of get at and dispel some of the myths that might be out there, or just start to think about how we are really creating this good, nice, collaborative experience from the start. We can go to the next slide. We can also think about, again, this idea of partnership. What concerns do you have, right? We want to know from the get-go, what are some of your concerns? We can think about things like, how do you like to receive feedback? I don't think that's a question that I know I ask very often in my coaching, and I think it's really important. Some people might want the feedback in person. Some people might want it in email so they can read it and process it before the next meeting. I think that these are places where we start to say this is a real collaboration and it's not about a power differential. And we want to make sure that we're spending time here to establish this. We can go to the next slide. We also can think about this is a really important place to acknowledge the expertise that our practitioners are bringing in. And so this idea of I can't wait to learn from you, I think can sound disingenuous unless you really mean it, right? Like I learned so much, right? I learned more from probably the practitioner who I'm sitting with than I'm giving them. I feel that way all the time. Like, thank you for coaching me on something or teaching me something new. And so really digging into what are your interests? What are your experiences? Tell me more about that. What did that feel like for you? What did that look like? How do you see that now in your experience? How do you see that impacting families you work with? Or how do you see that as you think about the children that you are working with? So again, really holding that idea that there is a lot of expertise out there and a lot to learn. We can go to the next slide. So this is our last little scenario, and I resonate with this because I feel like Gretchen sometimes, where she is our pyramid model champion, right? She's a person who has bought in, she gets it, she's energetic about it, and she has a million different ideas, but sometimes it feels like we are just talking about all the ideas, and it's really hard to take those really great conversations and those ideas and translate them or to put them into selecting an initial goal to start to work around. And so when we experience something like that, or as we're thinking about the goal setting process, motivational interviewing can be really helpful. And some of the strategies we might use are, we can go to the next slide, are thinking about focusing, right? So how do we start to maintain a really good direction for the conversation that we're having about change? So sometimes we might be in that space of, I just want to have the conversation because that keeps us engaged. And then I don't really have to make the change because maybe I'm not really ready to make the change yet, or I'm not sure, I'm indifferent. And so some of the pieces we can talk about are things like, you have so many great ideas, and I'm wondering what you want to talk more deeply about. So how do we start to narrow that focus into one topic? Or things like, what changes, if any, do you hope will come from our time together today? So micro changes, right? Even just from the conversation, are there little tiny shifts that you're hoping or you're wondering might be supportive out of this one conversation? And then also things like, what changes do you feel most ready to make? And I think that can be an important one. You have so many ideas. What's the one you feel most ready to go for? You can go to the next slide. And from there, I think this is such an important strategy, and maybe I'm projecting out there, but I think oftentimes it's really easy to slip into that telling versus the asking. And so when we're thinking about this idea of evoking, we're really holding the idea that we are asking for a person's own motivation to change, right? We are asking them to tell us about why they might want to change or what their motivational level is. So again, we have some of those ideas of what are the advantages of changing. And I think we talked about this a little earlier, of saying like, there might be some really good advantages. And then also thinking about what are the advantages of not changing, It might be, I'm really stressed out right now, and I don't feel like I can have one more thing in my brain to be thinking about, right? Well, that helps us to understand where the motivational level is, and it might help us to identify a different goal to support around. We can go to the next slide. And then last but not least, we want to be thinking about the planning, right? So as we are using motivational interviewing strategies to help support goal setting, we want to make sure that we have that plan that has enough structure, has enough accountability, and of course, reward. We want to be able to celebrate when change has been identified or motivation to change has been identified, right? Celebrate the effort, celebrate the outcome, whatever that looks like. And so some of our sentence starters for that might be things like, how did you know you were ready to move to the next step? What did that look like for you? What did it feel like? How was that for you? What is the next step? What's the next part on the plan, right? I don't need to tell you the next step on the plan. What do you feel is the next step on the plan? Where are we going next? And then also, of course, thinking about our potential barriers and being able to, again, sort of think about, are these barriers going to hinder some of our ability to change our motivational levels? We might bring out our scale again to say, where are we on this? We can go to the next slide. And so last but not least, I think as we think about motivational interviewing and coaching, and we think about this idea of being alongside with our coachee or our provider, reflecting on our own practice is such an important place to start and to continue to think about in order to be able to have these conversations, use some of these strategies in a way that feels authentic, and in a way where we may be thinking ourselves, how ready am I to change a little bit of my practice? How comfortable do I feel with that? And so these are just some ideas of places to start. And I think one of my favorite questions on here is the last one, which is talking about how often do you seek permission from providers to engage in these conversations? And I think particularly right now with staffing challenges and stress levels and all the things that we're hearing about, it is so important that we are holding this at the forefront to say, is it okay if we talk about this today? We know things are changing really quickly. And so being able to solicit that permission or to ask that permission is really important. We know some people, maybe we have great coaching relationship and we work, and there's a day where they're like, I can't, it's not the day, I can't talk about this. This isn't where I'm at. And so just continuing to have that permission and use it as a check-in, I think can be really helpful and supportive.
So I have one very quick question for whichever one of y'all wants to take this. So someone had, or a few people had a question about all of this seems so effective and like the way to go. And what happens when there's kind of an urgent need, like there's a behavior in the classroom where that's really could be dangerous or particularly challenging, and there's not time to kind of slow down, right, to get the person's buy-in. Have y'all thought about that?
It happens, right? I feel like so many of the situations, well, there are many situations where it feels so urgent, right? And it so often when we're pulled in or when there's an identified piece, it feels incredibly urgent for the child, for the situation. I think I still might be mindful that taking a little extra time in the conversations to tune in to what's happening for the caregiver will ultimately move me forward more with the caregiver, the teacher, the family, moving forward than if I just am like, hey, you got to do this, you got to make this change. Like it's not going to work, right? I mean, anytime we know when we're telling someone something that we think they should do, like that's just a setup for it not working, right? It's just a setup to make it worse. And Julia, you said something earlier that ultimately we want them to have another conversation with us, right? And we want to have a few conversations that will probably, I'm hoping, through our relationship might move us or might help them identify, yeah, okay, I'd be willing to try a couple of these things. But I'm 99% certain that if we just tell them, hey, I think you should do X, and I think you should do it right away because this is a problem. And if you don't do, I mean, immediately that's going to raise up folks' defenses, and it's not going to get us where we know is going to be best for the child or the situation. I don't know, Julia, what would you add? And Emma, I know you have had a lot of experience with this as well. So
I would just say that.
Oh, go ahead, Julia. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the same thing. Sometimes when we are really intentional and we do come in and we start right from this place, a lot of times there's a lot of frenzy around that big behavior that's happening or something really unsafe's happening. And I know it and you know it and the family knows it and other families know it. And right, there's a lot of energy around that. And so when we can come in and just start with something a little more relational, a little more basic, even though we know this is a very timely issue, it just can take that level down for everyone a little bit. And I think everyone wants to feel that relief. That teacher or that provider or that caregiver wants to feel that relief. That director, that family, they're looking for that relief. And so how are we able to come in and say, I know this is really urgent and we still have time to talk about some of these pieces because it's really, really important. And like Amy said, I think 9 times out of 10, that moves the needle a little further than, okay, here's the plan, ready, go, boom, 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 which doesn't always feel good when we're not validated in our experience or seen. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I just would wrap it up by saying that I think that it's not as urgent as it seems most of the time. In other words, I think that if there's unsafe behaviors and elopement behaviors and stuff like that, that's kind of a different issue. But I think a lot of time what feels urgent maybe isn't as urgent, and the way and how y'all are talking about it will help get to a solution that will actually match what the situation is better than if you hurry into something.
And I know I think we're all saying something about slowing down a little bit, and I know we're at time, but something you said resonated with me, Julia, around the relationship. My guess is, I mean, most teachers go into teaching to want to make a difference, right? And in these situations, they're feeling like they're not making a difference. They are probably pretty upset. They're probably pretty worried. They have a lot of emotions. And if we go in with something like, you just need to do this better, or you just need to, implement this plan, or I have the solutions, or, all of those kind of things. Of course, no one would talk the way I'm talking, but, give those inadvertent messages that they're not doing it right, or that, something is really wrong with their practice. It's just going to make them feel worse and, kind of probably back up even more, or maybe raise up resistance even more.
Thank you guys so much. I have so many more questions, and people are saying, is there going to be a follow-up and all of that? But I also know we are out of time. So Victor, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for their wonderful insights. Your feedback is very important to the work that we do. Please remember to provide your feedback on this webinar with our post-webinar survey by typing the web address shown on this slide into your internet browser. Your certificate of attendance will appear once you submit the survey. We invite you to visit our website, challengingbehavior.org, to sign up for our upcoming webinars, access recordings, download pyramid model resources, and much more.